of community learning at NLP, and I'd like to thank everybody here today for coming out and joining us for this event. And a special, special thank you to everybody joining via live stream. We are here today to explore why trust in the news is declining amongst Americans and learn from a panel of innovative Chicago journalists who are doing the work to repair relations and build trust in their work. Chicago has produced some of the most renowned journalists in the country and is home to some of the most innovative and cutting-edge media organizations in the country. Joining us today are journalists from the Chicago Sun-Times, City Block Club Chicago, and City Bureau. The News Literacy Project is a national, nonpartisan education non-for-profit that provides resources and training for students, educators, and the general public as they become more engaged and active consumers of news media. This week marks the 4th annual National News Literacy Week. This underscores how right now is such a critical time in our country's history for people to understand the skills of news literacy so that they can be more active and engaged in their communities. We would love to give a special thank you to the EW Scripts company who helped create the week and is the co-sponsor, as well as Northwestern University, where my alma mater. So I'd love to give a special shout out to Northwestern as well for hosting us for this event. But before we get into the panel discussion, I'd like to introduce Michael Spikes, lecturer at Medill School and the director for Teach for Chicago Journalism. He's going to help us understand the state of trust in our media landscape. Michael also credits himself as a practitioner scholar with more than 15 years in media literacy education. Excuse me. He's most recently been involved in the implementation strategies for the media literacy education requirements in all high schools across Illinois. Let's welcome Michael to the podium.
Thank you, DeMario. So, as you heard, I'm Mike Spikes. I'm a lecturer here at the Medill School and director of Teach for Chicago Journalism program here at Northwestern University. So Teach for Chicago Journalism is actually part of a program called the Metro Media Lab, a program that's funded by a grant from the McCormick Foundation that supports a comprehensive set of initiatives aimed at strengthening local news and journalism education in Chicago. These efforts include a Midwest Solutions Journalism Hub, direct work with news organizations on understanding consumer research and developing news product innovations, and Teach for Chicago Journalism, which supports and expands scholastic media opportunities throughout the Chicagoland area for young people to engage with and practice journalism and news literacy skills. Tonight, this panel comes together through a partnership with the News Literacy Project in Medill's Metro Media Lab to examine trust in U.S. news media and how local newsrooms are tackling this issue. In this brief introduction to the program, I'll look to set the table for tonight's discussion through presenting results from a recent study undertaken by Medill and Harris Insights on tonight's issue, which highlights further need for news media literacy education. So today, we consume media in an increasingly fractured media ecosystem that consists of news, opinion, entertainment, facts, and falsehoods that have coalesced increasingly on digital platforms like social media and streaming media, creating intense competition for mediums like broadcast TV and radio and print publications. Today's media consumers are essentially prosumers, a mix of producer and consumer, engaging with media through a wider variety of devices. With those devices and ubiquitous internet access, today's prosumers both consume, create, and share media through open digital platforms. But those platforms do not always make distinctions between the wide variety of genres of content that people can find online. So the traditional markers that we usually use, such as time and practitioners, such as seeing news people on ABC7 at a certain time of the day, usually indicated to us as audiences what content we were consuming. But more so these days, these markers are now intentionally being blurred together on social media platforms. You scroll through platforms like Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok, and you'll find a confusing mix of entertainment, news, such as this post from the Chicago Tribune on Instagram, advertising, promotion, or something else. All in the same place, all looking very much the same. And when scrolling through this content, it can be difficult to tell the difference between all of them. Now, the variety of content that can be found online certainly opens the door for exposure to a wide variety of viewpoints and voices. However, these relatively open platforms also leave the job of determining the credibility and reliability of sources of information, especially information that consumers use to make decisions and take actions up to their own devices. So this then makes a strong argument for improved learning around how to parse and navigate this noisy media ecosystem. This includes increased media literacy education, of which news literacy is a subdomain of to help consumers build skills for determining what information is credible and what's not. Now, Illinois took a big first step with this when it became the first state to put in place a requirement for media literacy into law. Now, the lessons that encompass media literacy and its various subdomains comprise much of my own research agenda. One of the outcomes of news literacy is to help consumers use the skills used by journalists to do their jobs for determining the credibility of information in order to build a collection of trusted sources of information from which they can rely, and to help them make sense of an increasingly complex world. We traditionally think of news outlets as being those trusted sources of information, but online platforms have presented challenges to that trust, with examples of influence campaigns that mimic the look of news outlets and also news websites, producing which is sometimes called pink slime journalism. Pink slime referring to the paste-like meat product that was sometimes added to ground beef, and that some people really didn't like seeing on TV. So Medill wanted to find out what the current landscape of trust looks like in our current era. So in 2019, Medill and Harris Insights began an exploration into the topic of trust in the media. They began with an online survey given to a panel of more than 2,000 participants to find out levels of media trust before the 2020 presidential campaign. The responses from the panelists were weighted to represent the US population. As the researchers began to analyze the results, the COVID-19 pandemic had begun to emerge, making major impacts in March of 2020. And as a result, the research team decided to run a second wave of the study in late May 2020, nearly 6 months after the initial survey. Here are some of our findings. In the resulting 2 surveys, the team found that trust in news media overall increased slightly from 53 to 55% between periods when respondents were asked how trustworthy they found the news media as an organization, among others. When asked about their levels of respect for different professions, the results showed that doctors overall received the most respect and members of Congress received the least. Maybe not that surprising. Journalists fell between these points, with 67% of respondents saying that they had somewhat or very much respect for the profession. Now, when trustworthiness was broken down by generation, the results found that trust in news media was split pretty evenly. When respondents were asked what organizations and institutions they found trustworthy and not trustworthy. That said, trust of news on social media, however, was very low. leading us to believe that respondents can make distinctions between news gathered from both places, despite the confusing mix of content that floats around on it. Now, while trust in news could certainly be improved, news consumption was high during this period. We found some 92% of respondents accessing news at least once in the last week, and 73% reporting that they had done so in the last day. And this includes both national and local sources. We also asked respondents what kinds of sources they had used in the last week, and online and TV sources were among the most popular. Now, these numbers bode well for understanding that Americans have a healthy appetite for news, although their levels of trust, again, could be improved. Now, finally, I'd like to emphasize that relationships that people have with news and news media are complex, and we see this in some of the last few findings we got. And I hope that these findings will also help out with tonight's discussion. First, while our respondents were voracious consumers of news, they tended to favor sources that supported their own viewpoints, with examples of this including Fox News being most watched news outlet among Republicans, while CNN was the most watched amongst Democrats. Now, when asked, respondents felt that journalists in the news media should be impartial in their reporting, but they tend to believe that they are not. This may not be surprising given their choices of top outlets, who both give consumers a mix of news and opinion. Most of our respondents were also distrusted news on social media and were very concerned about fake content online. That being the case, some 42% of them still found themselves consuming news there every week. Now, these findings were largely comparable to those that were found in similar surveys given by Pew and other organizations that showed during the same time period that trust in news rose during the outset of the COVID-19 pandemic and then began to fall somewhat in the last year. And one last interesting data point that I'll point out, when Pew asked their own respondents about their levels of trust of information on social media, the results showed increasing numbers of trust in that information, especially among young people. And those numbers are starting to become very close to their amount of trust in national news organizations. Something to take mind of. So with that, I will turn things over to our moderator, Omar Jimenez. As a correspondent for CNN, Omar has helped lead their coverage of both national and international stories since 2019. He has won a National News and Documentary Emmy Award for his coverage of the death of George Floyd in 2021. And most importantly, he's an alumni of Medill. Please welcome Omar Jimenez.
All right, so you all can hear me great. How are you all? A lot of purple in the crowd, go Cats. We've got a great talk that we're about to have with some amazing panelists, so I want to invite them on stage now. We're going to have them do some of their own introductions, but in short, we've got Jennifer Coe, who's the executive editor of the Chicago Sun-Times, Jen Sabella, who's director of strategy and the co-founder for Block Club Chicago, and Alejandra Cancino, who is the deputy editor for City Bureau. Give it up for them as we welcome them on stage. All right, so I do have bios on these folks, and I could read that off, but I figured who better to hear from than themselves. So real quick, why don't we just go down the line here, tell them a little bit about who you are, the work you've done, and why you're so excited to be here. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, good job. My name is Jen Sabella. I'm a co-founder and director of strategy at Block Club Chicago. I co-founded Block Club in 2018 after DNA Info was shut down by our owner, billionaire Joe Ricketts. We decided we thought it could work. A lot of people were really upset when DNA Info shut down, so we decided to do it our way, and so far it's going pretty well. I'm from the southwest side of the city where I live, and I went to Columbia College, sorry. But my wife worked at Northwestern for a while, so. And Dean Charles Whitaker is on our board at Block Club.
Hi, Alejandra Cancino here. I am the deputy editor at City Bureau. Before that, I was a senior investigative reporter at the BGA, and then before that, I was at the Chicago Tribune. I've been around for a little while. I actually graduated from the University of Florida. Go Gators. Don't hate me.
Hi, I'm Jen Coe. I'm executive editor of the Sun-Times. I was previously the managing editor of The Guardian in the US and HuffPost. I am really new to Chicago. I just got here in September, and I'm from LA originally, but I've lived in a lot of places, including Oaxaca, Mexico, and New York, and Oakland. Really excited to be here because I think this is a really important issue, and I'm excited to be here with this panel and this moderator. Thank you.
No, it's a really important topic, and I'm just going to dive right in. I should say, too, we're going to leave some time at the end for questions from you all, about 25 minutes or so. So be thinking about some of those, and we'll bring you in towards the end of the conversation. But for right now, I just want to start a question for all of you. Is you all work in various parts of Chicago's media landscape. Where would you say the state of media credibility is in Chicago right now? Jen, I'll start with you since you're closest.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we actually have been working a little bit with Medill on some of these surveys, and I do see like some trust going up. I remember City Bureau actually did a big survey of news media consumption in Chicago a few years ago, and it was pretty bleak. But the numbers, especially on the south and west sides, communities that have been covered poorly, frankly, for many years by the media here. But it has gone up, as we saw in our the study that Medill did. There's more trust, and I think a lot of that is people showing up to these communities and actually listening, and less parachuting in and assuming to know what a community is about.
Yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with how many years there have been without reporters actually covering those communities, without reporters actually being part of those communities. I mean, we hear a lot from communities. The question is like, well, you know, why are you here? You haven't been here in a little while, and we don't know you, and why should I trust you, right? And I do think that like we continue to hear that, but I do think that the events that we put on at City Bureau, the events from Block Club, and kind of like what I will call the engagement journalism umbrella, all of the events from the big papers as well, and you know, all of the amazing nonprofits that we do have here in Chicago do help, right? Like when we take them all together, like people are seeing more of us, more of our faces. They're seeing us in the communities, and I think that has helped tremendously in elevating the trust that people have of journalism here.
It's hard for me to compare because I'm so new, you know, so I can't really say if it's gone up or down over time, but I will say compared to other places that I've lived and worked, I've been pretty impressed at like how much engagement there is with news in general. You know, even in New York where like there were so many different news outlets and everything like that, I didn't get so much like just on the street, people who when I'm in a car or something like that, even in the train sometimes, you know, people seem really interested and engaged in what's happening. And so I think that's a real opportunity to build some trust because there is some interest and some engagement. And I think trust is like complex because there's a lot of times when like someone might trust the news for one particular thing, but not necessarily in all of the areas that you cover and in all the neighborhoods. And I think trust actually goes up and down with different people at all different times. So I think it's really hard to kind of like, you know, wrap around it in like kind of like as it's one, if it's one single metric or something, you know?
Yeah, and Jen, I'll stay with you. You and the Sun-Times, you all recently kicked off a series of community listening sessions. So I'm curious, why do them? And I know you've already done some already. What have you heard about the state of where readers are right now and about what they're asking for from reporters?
Yeah, so my interest in this started, before I started at the Sun-Times. At HuffPost, we did a series of listening sessions, and it was really transformative. We actually changed the entire newsroom based on what we heard from people around the country. And then, as a consultant, I got to work on a lot of different research, looking at what people actually want and like and don't like from media outlets in different places. And Chicago was actually one of them. And there are some things that are quite specific to Chicago that we're finding in our listening sessions, but there's a lot of stuff that is pretty universal nationally. And so, for instance, one thing that I heard a lot, right, is that people really want to hear a lot more about solutions. They want to hear more about what are people actually trying, what's actually being done, and what is working, but also what isn't working, so we can just avoid wasting time, like by trying the same things over and over again. I think people feel, what I've heard a lot is like, people feel that the news kind of covers institutions and people in power. They get to kind of see the same people over and over again, and they want to hear more about what life is like for average people. There's not really an average person, but like for people who don't have a big title or a big institution behind them. And then thinking about, instead of just documenting like highs and low points of everybody's life, thinking about sometimes documenting the normal, sort of what is actually, what is life like today. That's actually a really interesting thing to document, right? And it tends to sometimes get lost. So those are some of the things we've heard. There's a lot more. People feel that the mix of news in different communities is not the same, that some communities get more negative news, and some communities get more positive news, and yet positive and negative things happen everywhere. Like good and bad things happen everywhere, right? So thinking about how to improve the mix, diversify sourcing, diversify the kind of thing we consider to be news, and then also, definitely talk about the bad stuff that's happening and the problems, but also like what are people actually trying to do.
Yeah, and the best and worst times, I think, is even an issue, especially in national media. Like, I've had a lot of experience. I'm dropping into places on the worst days of people's lives, and I'm there for that week, and then I leave. Just Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, when you might not get what is actually happening after it's over. So I think that's a really poignant point. Jen Sabella, I know your mission at Block Club, and I'm quoting here, is to build community through truly ground-level reporting of the city's neighborhoods. So tell us all a little bit about how basically Block Club went from a Kickstarter to where you are now, and what you felt like along the way was maybe missing in the journalism ecosystem that you felt like Block Club could fill.
Yeah, so it's funny because I was actually at the Sun-Times and HuffPost, like Jen, before I was at DNA Info, and I thought I'd move to New York or LA and do national news. I'd never thought of myself as a local news person. But after DNA Info, I just saw how plugged in people were, and I saw impact immediately. Whereas at HuffPo, I would be counting how many comments we got on a story or how many likes or shares. At DNA, I would have email after email being like, "Thank you for covering this. You changed my life." Or thank somebody's business. "Oh my God, you guys wrote about our business. No one has ever come over here, let alone written about our business." So Block Club, we just kind of went back to that, but we did it in our own way. We did it as a nonprofit. Instead of hiring a big ad team, we wanted people to be able to sign up and pay if they feel like it's valuable to them. And I always thought, people will pay for this if we're providing them a service. So we just keep showing up. Our reporters are based in the neighborhoods they cover. So like Maxwell Evans, who covers like South Shore, Hyde Park, he lives in South Shore. He walks by and is like, "What's opening there?" It really helps because it's the things that you're wondering about as a resident of a neighborhood that these reporters are writing about. And we're not too good or too big for any of it, to be honest. We'll write the little story. We're not submitting it for a Pulitzer, but we know that a few people in that neighborhood will care about it, and it'll take us a few minutes, and it's a nice thing to do, whether it's a church coat giveaway or a food pantry or an actual news story. We kind of go all over the place. So I think just being there and showing up and letting them know we're not leaving. We are your neighbors too, has made people invest in us, and that's why we're growing so much. And we have an investigative team being built and an arts team coming, so we're really excited.
And I think that's a huge part of it too, like trying to give your readers the impression that we also live here and we care about what's happening in the city, you know, almost as much as you do, depending on where you are. And Alejandra, it's something that you touched on a little bit, and it was an interview I think that you gave to the City Bureau when you first started at the City Bureau. But you said if you're not really writing in a way that people understand the information, then they're not reading. And I thought that was really interesting and on point. So one, I just want to ask, what do you mean by that? And are there any specific examples that come to mind of maybe pitfalls that are typically out there in journalism that are maybe described or written in a way that like no normal person would understand?
It's so interesting that you asked that, because I think I've been thinking a lot about that, and I thought a lot about that as I reflected on the kind of reporting that I was doing at the BGA before moving into this editorial position at City Bureau. And I thought a lot about the mission of investigative reporting and why, you know, there's like such a need to uncover systemic oppression, right, which is partly what I was trying to do when I was there. And one of the things that really stuck with me was like, okay, so we build this, you know, like most of the time I was talking to people who had this like incredible story to tell and no one would believe them. And I was trying to figure out, how do I build a body of evidence to be able to support what the person is saying? Well, first of all, is what they're saying true? Then second of all, is how do I build this like body of evidence? And I would, right? We would spend a whole year on a project, which is, you know, such an undertaking for a small team. And it was very powerful in the ability that we had to be able to like retell history in a way that was like, that actually was more like the lived experience that people would have. But they made me think a lot about, okay, but then what? So I have, you know, built this body of evidence, and I'm, in many ways, we were rewriting history, but then what happens next, right? Like, and what happens with the communities that were impacted by this big issue? And it really made me think about, like, well, will a person that is working 3 jobs, which is a typical person in Chicago, have the time to read my 10,000-word investigation? And when would they do that, right? Like when they're putting their children to bed, and like and on their like 3-hour commute, if the CTA bus actually shows up. And so it just has become a question that I am quite frankly still trying to answer, right? Like, how do we provide information in the way that people who need it the most can actually access it? And is social media one of those ways? And if it is social media, like, do we move away from doing the thing that I've been doing for the last 15 plus years? Like, do we not write the stories anymore? Do we write instead, like, you know, Instagram posts or whatever the next social media thing will be? And I don't know, like, I really don't know what the answer is, but I really do believe that, like, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is providing information in which becomes increasingly more difficult, right? Because for news organizations, because you need more people, but providing information in all the ways in which the consumer will actually consume it. So that means providing a video, providing the written copy, providing the, you know, 2-second Instagram video, or the, you know, like the Instagram post. The Twitter still exists, so maybe we should go to the Twitter again and do some of those threads that no one reads. But like, you know, like, so it's increasingly more complicated because you have to figure out, you know, I guess like the golden age were the time in which you would write it in a newspaper and you knew that the consumer was going to pick up the newspaper and read the newspaper. And nowadays we're like chasing the consumer, the news consumer, and trying to figure out how to provide the information to them. And that's like, it's becoming increasingly more difficult, and I'm still struggling with that question, to be honest.
And that's actually a question I want to ask to both Jens as well, is there is this dynamic in some way of, okay, where are our readers? The readers have so many options of places to go, and so you have to make either your reporting stand out that much more or find ways to connect with them in ways that other people can't. But I'm curious, how do you balance, you know, maybe what consumers may want with sometimes we got to make the hard choices of this needs to be covered, and there are only so many resources. But how do you draw that distinction, if you ever draw that distinction. I just know that I've had to do it a few times. You do have to cover that boring city council meeting that has to do with whatever, when everyone might be saying, to go do something else. Is that a line that you all find yourselves walking at all?
Yeah, it's, as with everything, it's a balance, right? I think part of it is you should be able to explain why the thing that you think is important to the people that you think should know the thing. That's not the most articulate way I've ever said anything. But, but yeah, like, if you can't really explain, like, what is the impact of this thing on the people that should know it, then it's really hard. Well, who's going to read it, right? Or who's gonna consume it, right? So sometimes it might be about going to the meeting and not writing something, right? Because it's about trying to figure out, you may be trying to learn something, or it might be a like incremental piece of something that will be important to understanding. But if you can't explain that, then I think it can be a waste of time, right? So I think it's you make guesses, and you think that this is going to be important. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong, but at least you should have a theory on who you're writing it for, or producing it for, whatever it is, in whatever medium, and why they might be interested.
Anything you want to add? Or?
No, yeah, that's so spot on. Like, who is this for? I think that's the number one question we need to ask ourselves. Like, is this for us because we're nerds and we're obsessed with the news and this political subject makes us all worked up? No, like, it shouldn't be about that. And also when it comes to, reaching people in various places, I think partnering is so big in Chicago. I mean, you look at the Sun-Times and WBEZ. We partner with City Bureau. City Bureau partners with everybody. We partner with WCIU for a TV show. All of us have kind of gotten off our high horse about, we want to be the one and only news source, and we have worked together to not waste those resources. So if the Daily Line is covering a wonky zoning meeting, we call up Don at the Daily Line and we're like, hey, can we run this? We're going to send you this other meeting that our reporter's going to. And it's just a practical thing to do, and it's better for the public, and I'm so glad we've gotten there. There were many years there where it was just everyone was in their own little corners trying to duke it out, and I like it much better, and I think it's better for Chicago for us to work together.
Yeah, I mean, and we've all been in situations where you just don't have the resources to get to every single thing. So to have that dynamic, obviously, is a huge asset. Another one of those assets, Alejandra, I want to ask you about this, is you all have one of the most unique programs I think I've seen called the Documenters program. You train and pay people to cover meetings in their local communities. So tell me about the program one, but who are these people who show up and want to go sit in, potentially a boring meeting, but one that actually matters? Just tell me a little bit about the dynamics that you see in this program.
I love the Documenters program. I don't run it, but I do. I'm a huge fan of it because it is, when you think about news literacy, right? Journalism itself has its own lingo, right? So we have to start with training people to understand what is it that we mean when we say breaking news, when we say an investigation, an opinion piece, or whatever. But then you talk about city council meetings or just public meetings, and they have their own completely different lingo. I mean, the first time I went to a city council meeting, I was like, oh my God, what is happening? Did they just vote? Did I miss it? Did it go forward? What do I write? I don't know what to write, right? It's its own lingo. And so, I mean, I know from sitting in very long, boring meetings that a lot of citizens actually go to these meetings and they just don't know, they stand up and they make their comments, and then there's usually someone, a board member, who will say thank you so much for your comments, we'll get back to you, and they never do get back to them. And so the Documenters program provides a way for them not only to attend the meeting, to document it, but also ability for them to get trained in how to listen to this meeting, how to ask the right questions, what if they don't get access, we provide the support that they probably didn't have before to be able to ask questions of public officials. And it goes back to not only educating the consumer, but also providing the tools that people need to be able to have agency in their own lives, right? Oftentimes, I think that maybe an old-fashioned way of thinking about journalism is that we were the voices of people or speaking for people. Well, we don't have to do that. People have their own voices, and we can provide the tools to inform them so they can say the things that they want to say on their own. And that's part of why this program is so dear to my heart.
Yeah, no, 100%. And one of the things, as we talk about credibility in media, one of the things that really solidifies that is kind of who you have on staff. Who do you have that's out there as your voices for some of these folks? And in the context of that, Jennifer Coe, I want to ask about someone who used to write columns for you. His name is John Fountain. And for those that don't know, this is a regular columnist for the Sun-Times. In submitting a column at the end of November, he says you and him got to an impasse over this, and eventually you all parted ways. So one, I just want to get your perspective on what happened there, but two, he was one of the few, if not the only, black columnist for a major daily newspaper here, and who actually lived here. And I understand you probably felt it was necessary. I don't want to get into why that decision was made, but what do you think you lose when you lose a voice like that? And if there are efforts to try and replace, what do you think about when you try to replace a voice like that?
Yeah, I mean, I really can't talk about personnel issues, but I will say that, I really do appreciate having his voice. I did appreciate it. So yeah, I think that part of it is it's really important for, as we talked about, for content to be understandable and to have an audience and to be aimed at that audience. And so no matter kind of who it is who I'm working with and editing, I do expect a certain standard and that kind of thing because I really care about the readers. And I think it's really important to think about every piece as serving the readers. And so that's the case with every single reporter that I work with, regardless of whether they are on staff or freelance or columnists. So one of the things that we're doing is actually we are working toward a contest that will be coming out with our 75th anniversary, and that contest is specifically to reach and to elevate some next voices in Chicago. So look out for that February 1st. But yeah, one of the big goals that I have is to really find people with things to say on topics that we maybe have not traditionally covered, but that actually really matter to different communities, and find these voices within the communities, that people need to hear.
And along those topics of voices, Jen, you quote tweeted something that said, This is a tweet. I'm reading from another tweet. No. It's the tweet said, this isn't you. You're quote tweeting someone saying this. I had a 3.1 GPA, went to state school, and had a few extracurriculars on my resume because my 30-plus hour a week job took all my time. Please don't use those criteria to narrow down your applicants. Now, that was talking about intern recruitment, but I think that also applies very much so to who we decide to hire in our newsrooms. And so I'm curious, why did you resonate so much with that, at least enough to quote tweet it, which, why did you resonate so much with that? And what do you think that adds to the credibility or strength of the newsroom?
Yeah, I mean, that was me. I screwed up in college because I was working 3 jobs. I mean, that's just how it was. I didn't have I was also applying for loans on my own. I was the first person in my family to even go to college. So it was just a lot. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I was just I wanted to do this journalism thing. So I worked at the school paper. I did an unpaid internship. And I let my schoolwork go. I mean, it just didn't care. I was like, I'm going to write stories for the paper. I'm going to do my internship, and I'm not going to this class. I think, though, why I've been successful in this town is because I love it. I'm from here, and I'm a real human who grew up here among all different kinds of people of all different socioeconomic statuses and races. I think that often in journalism, when I was starting out, it felt like everyone was Ivy League from New York, and they were the ones being hired, and there was no way I was going to get anywhere. And I think that the people of America said, screw that. We don't want that. We want to trust people, and we want people to tell the stories that resonate in our lives. And I think in order to tell those stories, you need those lived experiences. When you come into the newsroom and have an idea based on your life, like when my mom's gas bill went up like $300 for her 1-bedroom apartment. I come in and I'm like, we have to do something on these gas bills. We have to do something to interview people in the neighborhoods and make sure they know about services. And just having a diverse socioeconomic newsroom and racially diverse in every way is important. But I remember being that intern or trying to be that intern and not getting anything because I just didn't have I couldn't do a 40-hour-a-week intern. I had a 40-hour-a-week job.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important part of the diversity conversation. Like, I think in national media especially, there is a lot of the Ivy League mentality. The people that are in New York, the people that are in D.C. Are from New York and D.C. or they're from the coasts, and especially for us in the national media, there's a whole country in between. And I think we have to do a better job at, making sure we're boots on the ground there. Now, Alejandra, I read about what drew you to City Bureau, and partly was that you spent 2021 thinking about how to create new paths for journalists of color to become investigative reporters, to learn the tools that you have. But you said something interesting in that is you didn't just say reporters, you said investigative reporters. And I'm wondering if that distinction was on purpose, and do you feel like that space is one particularly that just is not seeing the amount of color that should be there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think about, like how important investigative journalism is today, especially we are living in a time in which it's getting increasingly more difficult to find what the truth is, right? Like, we can get access to public officials, like whenever you call them. I mean, there was a tweet about this as well earlier this week, right? You call them and they ask you to go to the press person doesn't want to answer the phone, they want to have it in writing. I mean, like, really, you have to be an investigative reporter for any beat that you have these days, because otherwise you won't be able to find any kind of information. And traditionally, investigative reporting has been a profession that has where mostly white men have been privileged enough to have. And I'm one of those very privileged people who have been able to kind of break my way in, if you will. And it required a lot of work. It required a lot of me training myself, because the newsrooms weren't sending me to the conferences, right? Like, I had to figure out a way to send myself. I had to figure out the way to pay for the conferences, to be able to find the mentors and whatnot. And I wanted to, I spent 2020 and 2021 thinking about, like, how could I contribute, right? Like, how do I make sure that there are other journalists who, like myself, who didn't have the means or the ability to go to a fancy school, to be able to open the doors for them. And so a friend and I created this mentorship program called the FOIA Fist Bootcamp. We recruit journalists of color. We mentor them. We partner them with mentors, mostly from Chicago, who do investigative reporting. And then, like, we, help them kind of get started in their first investigation and kind of understanding public records and how to access information that way. And I really loved that. I mean, it was like definitely like a passion project. Like, I spent most of my weekends when I was cooped up in my apartment, like working on this program and kind of getting it off the ground with my friend Maria Zamudio, who's amazing. Yeah, it was like really like one of the things that really drove me into like thinking about like, well, okay, what if I had this as a job, as a full-time job, and I did it like not on the weekends, but like on my 9 to 5, and I got that job. I'm doing it not on the weekends, but in my 9 to 5, and it's really lovely.
So cool.
That's an amazing feeling once that clicks. Now, one of the things we talked about is kind of how accessibility relates to credibility. They want to be able to see you. They want to be able to talk to you. Part of that, Jennifer Coe, you all made the decision in October to drop the paywall for digital content so people can just leave their email. So tell me about how that decision came about, but more on a practical level, what differences have you noticed in readers now that maybe you all didn't have data on beforehand?
So I just got here in September, so I don't have a whole lot of, background from before that.
You just add a wrinkle then,
Right.
and just say, what has been the feedback since this started that you've gotten, or what have you felt people have resonated most with after this move?
Yeah, well, obviously very excited about the move. if you look at, the places that I've worked and everything like that, I very much believe that, we need people to be educated and we need people to have access to the news. So it was a big part of what drove me to take the job, knowing that this was likely to be the outcome. So there's that. But in terms of the feedback, we have seen, a lot of people seem to really appreciate that they can get into the news, they can read as much as they want, they don't have to, pay, they don't get a paywall. And that means, and even though some people are still giving us money, right, voluntarily, like Jen was talking about, and I think it opens us up to a lot more opportunities to participate and to engage with the community. One of the things we did, we had a year-end premium edition. We usually do a kind of state of the last year, but what I wanted to do was, when you think about forming a relationship, people need to really get to know you first, and I wanted to start kind of breaking down some of that wall of like, this is the newsroom, versus the community, by starting to help people get to know who it is that is actually producing the news and what our perspectives are and how we are covering the news so that they could also weigh in. And so what we did was a lot of different people in the newsroom wrote about how they're approaching their beat or how they got a particular story, things like that. And I was really overwhelmed with the response. Actually, I also wrote my first, column for the Sun Times, really writing about my vision for it and how I want it to go into the future. The community approach and why I really want to hear from so many people in the community. And I was really kind of surprised and delighted by like the number of people who did write in, and who wrote about what they liked, what they had seen, how they felt about those stories, and also a lot of giving us a little hell too, which I also appreciated because that is engagement. If they're trying to make us better, that is engagement. So I really appreciate that. I answered everyone that wrote in to my email. I just put my own email, on there, and I think that's the kind of feedback that I'm hoping will continue, and that I was so excited to drop the paywall for.
Yeah, and one thing that I want to pose to all of you all is, it's one thing to interact with your readers in normal-ish times, but when it comes to elections, I think readers turn into a new gear, as reporters do too, but the types of comments and engagement that you get, I can even just say, if I tweet something about Trump or Biden, all of a sudden the responses I get is unbelievable. But here at the municipal level, we've got the elections coming up next month. We've got a big swath of candidates running for mayor, and I'm curious for you all, how have you approached covering the races at each of you all's publications? And how does the climate change with your readers when covering an election as opposed to not? This Jen, I will start with you.
Yeah, so the Sun Times does a fantastic job of covering the mayor's race in City Hall, and we frankly don't have the capacity to cover the mayor's race at this point, though we would like to have a City Hall reporter soon. But we do everything on the ward level. So we are either tomorrow or Thursday, hopefully tomorrow. I left the meeting, so I don't know if what they decided. We are rolling out a site. It's going to have all 50 races. You click on your ward, you have all the articles we've done on the alderman, the previous alderman, the people running. A lot of this is like neighborhood activists, so you'll see back when that neighborhood activist was activisting about something before they decided to run for office. So you'll be able to go deep and wonky on whoever's running for alderman in your ward on our site. And that was kind of when we all met, we're like, okay, well, the Sun Times and the Tribune and TV, they're gonna do a great job covering the mayor's race. What can we do? What is Block Club? And we are the aldermanic races. Like, they are the little mini mayors of each ward, and we cover them very closely. So, and I think it's important. I think people don't understand how important that job is as an alderman and how much power they have. So we're paying attention. They don't like it, and that means we're doing a good job.
I love that, mini mayor. Hashtag. I really, I think you all are doing an amazing job covering all of the. I wish I had, a team to be able to do what you're doing, because that sounds like really amazing. But we have a tiny team. So the way we did it is by first going into a listening session and asking people, sending out a survey about what people thought were like the big issues in the election this year. And then one of the things that keep coming up was affordable housing, right? Like, we know that Chicagoans are really struggling to pay the rent, and we know that they're really struggling to find affordable housing as well. And so we have a reporting house who covers affordable housing and economic development in Chicago, and then we partner them with our Documenters program, who is the program that launched that survey, and they're working on a story about affordable housing and specifically focus on the people who are running for mayor and what they think about how do they define affordable housing and what they think about affordable housing. That's hopefully running next week, so stay tuned.
We're lucky, we have WBEZ and the Sun Times together. We are lucky to be able to, really cover all different parts of the election. We have we have BEZ has their citizens agenda, and so we were able to get responses from thousands of people in the Chicago area and hear what the issues are that really matter to them. And then we were able to send questionnaires to each of the candidates in all the races related to those issues that we heard. So I think to your question though, Omar, in terms of how the kind of relationship and kind of tone of communication with readers ramps up, definitely true. I think part of it is the participation, which is really good. And we're basing a lot of our coverage on what people are telling us they want to hear, because it seems like the best way to have the impact we want to have. But I think there is also a lot of suspicion that everything we're doing might be in favor of one candidate or another, even though we're very careful. We're nonprofit, right? We're not endorsing anybody. We're really careful about that. But we are going to report the news and what happens with each of the candidates. But I think one of the things that is interesting is that it does show up in some distrust in some of the communications. Why are you running this story? Is it because, there seems to be sometimes, a feeling that there's an agenda there.
And I think that's fair to say for every publication, especially with social media, the way everyone's connected, people tend to believe there is a wider conspiracy to either cover or not cover certain issues of a race. But sometimes it is important feedback to be like, why aren't you covering? There have been many times where I always say, on social media, 95% of the times when people say, why aren't you covering this? I'm like, please just Google it. We have covered it. It's right there. Just please Google it. But every so often there is a legitimate oh yeah, we missed this water crisis happening, in Benton Harbor, Michigan, and why aren't we covering this? Only one publication has written about it. And so I do think there is this balance that sometimes can be frustrating to find for us, but I think is one that's really important. For everyone out there, I'm going to ask one more question, but then we are going to turn it over to questions for you all. So start thinking about it, get yourself ready, work up your courage, do whatever you got to do. But we're coming to you after this. The one I want to ask of you all is, we often hear journalism as the first draft of history. First draft. And so what that implies is that typically you are going to either add onto more information comes out later on. And I'm curious for you all at your individual publications, how do you handle covering something that may need to be covered, but you don't have quite everything yet? And then how do you reckon with the fact that maybe a year and a half later, once you have that information, the initial reporting may not have given the best impression? Not sure if anything comes to mind, but an example that always comes for me is when you cover a trial. Obviously, an allegation is an allegation, innocent till proven guilty. But it's hard for readers, when someone gets charged with something, not to assume that that person is automatically guilty. Many times, they come off innocent from the actual trial, and yet now you, as a publication, are covering it like you were before, but people may still have the impression that, he did it. So how do you deal with that balance? I don't know if there's anyone who wants to tackle it first.
Well, this is one thing for us when we launched that was a huge, we actually had a City Bureau Public newsroom on this, on crime reporting specifically. Erin, who's in the audience right now, she covered courts at DNA Info, and we were there every day. We were covering courts, we had covered cops, we covered all of it. At Block Club, when we started, we had 5 neighborhood reporters, and we all looked at each other and we said, we're not doing it. We're not covering crime, essentially. We're covering it on a neighborhood level, which means if something happens, we send our reporter out and they can be there in person and they could talk to someone other than the police, then we'll cover it. But there needs to be more sources here. There need to be more than just like what the police statement is and what their status was in the ambulance. And the same thing goes for court cases, I think, for us. So we honestly, like, well, we have covered a few cases when our reporter really dug in at the beginning, and we've seen it through to trial, but I would say maybe like 3 times that's happened. But typically, we leave it for other outlets to tackle that have more resources, because we do, and this was a criticism that Daryl from City Bureau, he worked with us also at DNA Info, and he was like, this is bullshit, man. Like, you're just writing what the police said, and we don't know if this is true, and you're right, this is what people believe. So I think that it made the whole city take a long, hard look at itself and the way it was covering crime. And I, like, kudos to Daryl and City Bureau for that. And it totally changed the way we cover crime at Block Club. So for now, we're not the ones doing that, but I do see the need, and I know that when you do these surveys, people say crime is top of mind. I think we as an industry need to find a better way to do that work and to really invest in that work, because it is time consuming to get it right.
And I'll add a wrinkle into it. I used the courts example, but another good one is oftentimes police may give a narrative of what happened initially after something happens, and then a week or 2 later, or even months later, sometimes years in the case of Laquan McDonald, you find out, oh, what they told us was actually not correct. And that falls, yes, on the police, but it actually falls on us, because we are the ones that put out that information. So I'll throw that wrinkle in, of course, when dealing with law enforcement, but go ahead, Alejandra.
I mean, I think this is why I love investigative reporting so much, right? Because we get the time to be able to look into these allegations and try to get to the bottom of it. I said, nothing is black and white. There's not just one way to present a story. Then we choose, this is, the whole talk about objectivity, right? Like, how could you be objective if you're just constantly seeing the world from your own perspective? Like, there's no such thing, right? And I think a lot about, like, for instance, like when I was working on a story about Cabrini Green, which was a public housing community here in Chicago, I went back into the archives and I was horrified by the stories that I read. I mean, people were portrayed as being violent, as being like this, horrible community. And you start asking the questions, right? If you're portraying a whole community as being violent, what are you actually saying? The majority of people who live in that community were black. Are you saying that black people are violent? Because there's no evidence whatsoever to make that claim. And so, like, how you write about people, like, really matters. And thinking about, what we know now, and like going back into those archives, that this is where, like, I was like, oh my gosh, like, what have we done? And people start believing that narrative, right? Like, so we are the first draft of history, which means that people then internalize their own racism that is presented to them in the form of news consumption. So that we have a big responsibility to ask ourselves those questions when we're writing, right? Like the first draft of history. How is this being presented? What are my viewpoints on this? And how is this being honest about it, right? Like, if we really are going to say, like, no one is really objective, then, like, think about your own views and perceptions and how that is being portrayed in the stories that you're writing and are presenting then to the news consumer. And that's something that I had obviously the luxury and the time to do when I was an investigative reporter. We do a version of that now in the sense that we really prepare, we have a fellowship cycle and we prepare really heavily for the fellows when they come in. We have a body of research and we ask ourselves and debate these questions often in our newsroom sessions to make sure that, like, we hear it not just from our perspective, but from the perspective of the fellows and the perspective of the communities that we're covering.
I actually think about this every day. I spend a lot of time thinking about how, we are the first draft of history. and we know that history has pretty much sucked, right? Like throughout, it's really hard to find a time when people feel that the history that predominantly has been taught is really actually inclusive and fair and everything. And so what we know is that there's a lot of room to grow and improve. And so I think it's about thinking a lot about that, like whose stories get left out, whose stories, matter in the kind of way that we frame the perception of, like, when we look back at a time, like you can't tell every single person's stories. And so, like, I think in the past we've thought a lot about the exceptions, right? We've told the stories of these exceptions, and I think it's really important now to tell stories of the people that are not exceptions too. Like, what actually is happening systemically? What is life actually like today that we'd want people to know about later? And so thinking about it from the perspective of, well, what we've done in the past isn't working. And so how can we improve? What are the most important ways to improve, and what things can we try so that we can get better? And it's like, obviously we're going to make mistakes. Everyone has, I think, throughout history has made mistakes, but I think the important thing is developing a culture where we can recognize, well, what is the impact we're having, regardless of our intent, and are there ways, we can improve it and be more thoughtful about that? And some of that is about, thinking about the patterns and, moving sometimes from the, like, this happened to a bit more context and a bit more of the perspective of how do we get here, and also, the environment in which different things are happening and what can be done. And so I think it's really just about, in some ways, deepening that sourcing of, like, how many people we're talking to, how many people's stories we're telling, and trying to spread the resourcing and the reporting a little bit thinner, instead of always going to the same people and telling the same, not even the same people stories, but the same narratives, if that makes sense.
No, of course. And those often become the hardest conversations, because it's easy when you're trying to go do a story last minute, you don't have a lot of time, it's easy to sort of slip into what's always been done, because it's just how you do it. But to take the time and actually think critically on how to break that cycle, I think is something that is valuable for the readers and would only increase credibility. So with that, hope you've been stewing on your questions. Are there any first takers? I saw this man right here, on the left in your sweater. You got a mic on your right.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Awesome. Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I have a question for all three of you, but I'll frame it with something from Block Club. It's really exciting to hear that Block Club will be doing an investigative team, and I wanted to ask, how does investigative reporting differ when it's on the hyper-local or neighborhood level from when it's looking at the larger city or state or country? And how do you build the kind of trust with sources on that level in your regular coverage and in everything you do to get to the point that you get that kind of information and tips that you need to do that?
Yeah, it's a great question. This all kind of started with our coverage of the COVID kind of testing and vaccine scams that were going on. Our reporter, Kelly Bauer, broke that. And that was just her every day doing, like, when COVID first hit, writing up the pressers, sending out all this information, all the information that people were looking for at the time. I mean, I'm sure you all know how crazy web traffic was then. Everyone was just like, give me more information. So after she was doing that for months and months and months and just showing up, we started getting emails from staffers of these clinics that were like, these tests aren't real. Or somebody at the Trump Tower who was like, my boss just got a vaccine. I don't think he's supposed to be getting one. So I think that same thing applies to our investigative. We already hired Mick Dumke, who was a mentor of mine and got me my first journalism job at the Sun-Times when I thought I was a waitress forever. Having him in our newsroom is beyond thrilling for me, but he's right now meeting with all of our neighborhood reporters, and they're just sharing with him like, hey, I've been here, I've been doing this for 3 years or whatever. And this is something that I think is happening, and he's helping work with them on how to dig deeper and learn some of those investigative skills. And that was a huge thing with this. We want our younger reporters and our greener reporters to be able to learn from investigative legends like Alejandra and Mick, and get that skill set, because that's what they want to do. They want to do big stories, but I think those little stories they get every day is what builds that trust.
I actually second that. Like the best way to build investigative stories is doing it that way. When you actually know the community, you know what's happening, you have an inkling of what's going on, but you don't know the answer to it, and you go find it. The way in which is sometimes portrayed in the media, and like you sit there and somehow the investigation comes to you, it's a lie.
Yeah, and it's a thing that a lot of, I think, young interns coming in, they're like, I want to do investigative. It's like, girl, you got to do some beat work first. And it really does build your skill set and build your sources.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add. I will say that it's so much fun to go to the Watchdogs unit at the Sun Times and see just like the incredible amount of files and documents that has been over years, or just you'll sit there and Tim Novak will just drop something about something that happened in the past that seems like incredible. Like he doesn't forget anything or let anything go. I mean, it's just amazing. And so I think the main thing is that investigative work, it takes time and it is work. Like it takes that drumbeat of like reaching out, of sourcing, of doing a lot of things that may not lead to stories, or working on other stories while you build something else. So yeah, I don't think there's any shortcuts really.
All right, anyone else? We got right here up front. Or Roger's already got it. There you go.
Fascinating discussion. Thank you, everyone. I guess my question is, as more and more media companies seem to be making the transition from predominantly advertising supported to donor supported, will that erode or enhance the public's trust in the media? So, and let me just give you an example. Let's say that in the upcoming months, it comes out that FTX, the cryptocurrency company that went bankrupt and made off with billions of dollars of clients' money, let's say it turns out that they gave some huge donations to various media companies, particularly public media companies. Is the public likely to say, no wonder those companies never did any investigative reporting on FTX in the last year or two? FTX was supplying a third of their annual budget.
I guess I would say both are true. That on the one hand, I do think people are more distrustful of brands and commercial advertisers than philanthropic donors, but that it's still really important to make sure there is independence. And I think that can actually be pretty articulated in the newsroom processes, in policies and things like that. But in general, people are pretty skeptical, right, of any kind of money. And if they see a connection, regardless of the reason behind it, like you said, someone didn't do an investigation and somebody had been a donor or something like that, people are going to believe that there's a connection regardless of whether or not there is. So I think the best thing is to make sure there isn't a connection, and to kind of build it into the policies and processes and workflows, to retain that independence, and then also to be open to like investigating if something seems off.
Right, having a protocol in place it's the most important aspect of it, and being transparent with our readers about where the money's coming from. I think there's always been a distrust, like whether it's advertisement money. I mean, I've heard it when I was at the Tribune, like, well, Exelon gives money, and advertising money to the Tribune, so they're never going to cover that. And we did cover it. We had someone full-time covering comment excellent, right? And so you hear it from both. I think there, like you said, there's always a distrust in money, and just having a clear protocol on how you accept donations, what kind of donations you may not accept at all because of political reasons. And I mean, we had an instance at City Bureau where someone wanted to give us anonymous money, and we actually rejected it, and the person decided to put their name on their money. And I think that's great transparency for the reader, right? Understanding where the money's coming from.
You know, at The Guardian, we had a really big deal with Unilever. They were supported some of the editorial independent content, and then the same day that came out, we had a big expose on Unilever. And because those things were totally unrelated, but even there, people thought that might be related somehow. So I think that's the problem. I mean, in some ways, I feel like, unfortunately, the wall never really worked because, you know, you have like an advertisement that because there's a wall that it just runs against a piece of content and then the advertiser did not know was happening, the content, people didn't know. So I think there's not really any way to avoid, I think, some of that perception sometimes of conflict, but we can try really hard to avoid the actual conflict and to explain it.
Not sure if the mic went elsewhere. You've got it, Stacey. All right. Yep. Go right there.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to hear from all of you. Following up on that last question, first of all, I just want to ask whether you're a startup news organization like Black Club or a pre-established larger organization, how do you decide to go the nonprofit route or not go the nonprofit route? And then in partnerships where you rely on sponsors or advertisers, how do you make sure that you're avoiding perceived conflict of interest, whether it's at the organizational level or with individual journalists?
Yeah, I mean, for us, going nonprofit was kind of like, so we got a grant for $500,000 to start Black Club, and this is through a cryptocurrency company. And they said they wanted to allow people to pay for news using cryptocurrency, and they were going to roll out their own cryptocurrency. And the deal was, this is the money, no strings attached, just like, if this coin ever happens, your site needs to be willing to take that as a form of payment. So we're like, okay, so it was either going 3 journalists with no business experience, either going to try the venture capital route or this. So we took this money from the cryptocurrency company, which failed, but we got the funds to start up, and we did a Kickstarter, and we made another about $250,000 on that. And then we started working the philanthropy route, and we knew. I mean, I'm a huge NPR fan. I've been an NPR nerd forever. So I was saying this at DNA Info. I was like, we should be doing a membership. We should be doing a membership. We can give tote bags. People will give us money. But even though, like, I even thought with Joe Ricketts running it, people would have given us money because they liked the coverage of their communities. But I think that we just took a chance and we said, all right, we're going to do this nonprofit route. I think it increases trust. I never wanted to do any opinion content. I think it's because I'm a millennial and came up with social media, and I was like, people cannot discern between news and opinion sometimes. So I just was like, we're not going to touch that. Nonprofit works for this. Let's try it. And honestly, the first, I would say, 3 years, we got very little in terms of large donations from philanthropies, and we were reader supported. We were 75% reader supported for 3 years, which is enormous. And we were able to grow thanks to the readers. And then on year 3, I think people were like, all right, they're sticking around for a minute. So some of the bigger foundations, like the McCormick Foundation, which is funding our investigative team, they stepped up and they made larger gifts. But our whole thing is we're really transparent. Like, we send out our newsletter every day, and we write a note when we get those donations. We tell people exactly where they're going to go, and they will follow up with us. If we say we're going to hire a reporter in this beat with this money, they'll be like, "Where's that reporter? When are they coming?" So we are really transparent, and I think that helps with accountability.
I mean, look, I actually think the world needs a lot of journalism, more than we have now, like a lot more than we have now. And so I'm in favor of kind of anything that will support real journalism. And I think there's the for-profit and nonprofit thing to figure out, but even within that, there can be diverse revenue streams. You know, we, like at the Sun-Times, still have advertising and membership and, you know, philanthropic funding. I guess it's really about assessing where you think the type of journalism that you want to do for the type of community that you want to do it for has the highest potential, you know, to sustain the journalism that you want to do without it having to be corrupted into something that is no longer real journalism, right? So if you think through, you know, you can get enough advertisers and sponsors and things who want to support independent journalism based on what you're trying to accomplish and the information you're trying to, you know, portray for the community that you have in mind and for the audience you have in mind, then you should go for that, you know. And if that's not the case, if you think the kind of journalism you want to do is actually something that a lot of people, readers and audience members want, or a lot of foundations really care about those kinds of topics, then it makes sense to do that. But I've also seen, you know, that there are examples of people changing, like the Sun-Times.
All right, I believe I saw you get the microphone. So there we go. Yeah, the question's yours.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for being here. This has been super interesting. I was particularly interested in the media partnerships that you all were talking about, where you all are offering each other coverage in order to better serve the communities you're serving. And I thought that that was really great and really inspirational. But I was curious if media outlets with lower capital, because you made it seem sort of transactional, if they can't cover events as much, is it harder to enter into those partnerships because they don't have as much to give? And sort of regardless, is the result of this, because some outlets can cover more things, you know, more, that certain outlets have a more consolidated, like they're covering more of what's going on in Chicago through more outlets, just because there's so many partnerships going on and they have the most capacity?
I was just gonna say, like, for example, for us, like, we have a partnership with Austin Weekly on the West Side. They had a barely functional website as of a few years ago. Sorry, no shade. I mean, that was shady, but they had, and we know they have this great following in the neighborhood. So we're like, run all of our stories. We know that they were operating on, like, with one reporter/editor and a team of freelancers, and we said, take all of our West Side coverage, because those folks who pick up the paper and print, we want them to be able to read these stories too. So there was no transaction there. We combined our email lists and we send them out. And we're hoping to do more of that with, like, community papers. Essentially, we're partnering with people with, as we have a large audience, we're very fortunate to have a large audience, so we like to partner with people who may not have as big of a homepage audience to get the more eyeballs on it. And whether that, we haven't done any, I don't think we've done any, like, pay exchanges yet where we do a content, but we're actually, I think our new revenue director is in negotiations for some of those, but we're open to it. Like, I'm like, I don't know, I'm like a hippie about it, and I'm like, let's all share. We'll share a reporter. It'll be fine. But I know not everyone is like that. So we'll see. We are trying to just be as fair as possible and you know, get the word out there. And we're not going to force it on anybody. But if people want to throw their story in our newsletter, we're always happy to do it.
I'm a hippie too. I mean, that's the way we see it. I mean, we're like a tiny staff, and all of the fellowship stories, I mean, we're so thankful. We partner with the Reader and the Southside Weekly for this year. Most of the fellowship stories were run by both of them, and we were just happy that they will take them, because, you know, we're tiny and we don't have the audience that they have, and, you know, people actually pick up those papers and they read them, and so we were just super happy to produce the content in exchange for more eyeballs.
I think with a nonprofit model, one of the things is that allows us to focus on impact, right, as the key goal. And so it makes partnerships a lot easier. But But also, at HuffPost, we had a lot of partnerships that were also paid partnerships in some cases, or sometimes it was for other reasons, right? Like trying to grow audiences or trying to grow coverage in a particular area, or co-create, or do some like investigative project or something like that together. So there's a lot of different types of partnerships. They take a lot of time, and it's like trying to articulate exactly what each partner is kind of going to do, and why it makes sense, and what everyone's going to get out of it is really important. But I think ultimately, our biggest opportunity is not like taking market share and all covering the same stories. Our biggest opportunity is covering all these missing stories that nobody's covering and serving audiences that have for a long time never trusted any of us, right? We need to build, there's so many more people who are not reading than who are reading. And so anything that will let us better serve, the community, tell more of the stories that are missing, rather than all running around to cover the same thing, is just, it's a better service for everyone, and it's much more satisfying, I think, as a journalist and, organizationally.
All right, we've got time for one more audience question. I don't know if someone already has the mic, or if not, then we'll just go right here.
Yeah, hi, thank you for coming. Something that I was just curious about, this might be really simple, but like kind of what are the best practices for reporters in order to build trust in their communities, or what are best practices for a newsroom, if that's more the perspective you're working with?
I actually wrote that down. I would say, well, the three things that I always tell fellows are consistency, accountability, and listening sessions are like the bread and butter for us to regain that trust, right? Like, and the idea that, when it comes to consistency, like we created beats, and like City Bureau for the first time has actually beats, because people will remember the journalist, right? Like they will remember, oh, you wrote about this thing. And if you constantly start like change the thing that you're writing about, like people don't know that they can come to you for their problem. And at the end of the day, it's like whether a person will individually trust you or not will come down to that one time that they had an issue. Were you there to support them? Were you there to listen to them? Were you there to offer any kind of guidance or information, right? And so I think that's why it works so well that you have communities you cover. That's the beat, right? Like people know that there's the local person they can reach out to. Accountability in the sense of like, journalism is one of the only industries in where you actually had to own up to your mistakes, right? Like, and being transparent to the reader and saying like, I am human, I made a mistake, I am sorry, here's how it happened. I think that's a really big part to also regaining that trust.
Yeah, I mean, I think trust is inherently about a relationship, right? And I think what's so interesting is I was really struck by this. I think it was a Pew Research statistic about how few people have actually met a journalist. It's really hard to trust people you don't know. It's like, it's much easier to mistrust them. So I think part of what it is trying to, first of all, be human and humanize ourselves, like show kind of who we are and everything. It's about having lots of opportunities for people to get to know us, and that's a real advantage for a community publication, right? Because we have a much better chance than any like national publications or larger publications of meeting more of the people in the community that we cover. So trying to really increase those opportunities to meet people, increase the opportunities for people to interact in some way or get to know something about you is really important. And then as you were saying, it's like also being really transparent. So, I tried, I made a decision about Highland Park photo, and I wrote and explained exactly why we made that decision. And there was once a problem, at the garden we had a fabricator, and I had to help write, the story explaining, and we went through and we fact checked every single one of this person's work and took out anything we couldn't stand behind instead of the opposite. Instead of having to prove that there was a mistake, we actually took out everything we could, anyway, just explaining all of that stuff. I think on the one hand, it shows the mistakes, it kind of leans into some of the people's assumptions about the errors that we make, which is true, but on the other hand, I think helps to bring people into the conversation and give people some insight into, how are we doing the work? Why are we trying how are we trying to avoid these mistakes, and what do we do when we make them?
Lightning round answer for you. Number one thing for trust and accountability.
Yeah, I think showing up and having like an open mind and a good attitude. I mean, I think that sounds so cheesy, but sometimes journalists can have egos. I'm sure no one here has ever experienced that. But especially like you're starting out, like be humble, listen to people in the communities, and don't cast aspersions about someone based on where they live or what they look like. And it's the basics, but sometimes we need reminders.
Words to live by. Everybody give it up for these three panelists here. They were incredible. I feel privileged to have been your bridge to all of their amazing perspectives. Right now, as I understand, we are going to welcome onto stage the Dean of Medill, Charles Whitaker. So everybody give him a hand as he makes it his way on a stage here.
Thank you, Omar, for being here from New York and for your skillful moderation of this event. We really, really appreciate it. Thank you, Jen, Jennifer, Alejandra, not just for a fascinating discussion and sharing your wisdom, but for all that your outlets are doing in Chicago. You're providing wonderful coverage, and I say we are so proud at Medill to partner with you and hope to continue, not hope to, we will continue partnering with you as we do what we can to continue to revitalize the news ecosystem in Chicago and work toward its sustainability and viability. I also want to thank my colleagues, Mike Spikes for leading us off, Katie Fernandez of Teach for Chicago Journalism, who are, as they said, fanning out into Chicago public schools, helping Chicago public schools students not only develop an appreciation for journalism and perhaps a desire to become journalists, but an understanding of how vital journalism is to the maintenance of democracy and to maintaining the delicate fabric of our republic. And then I also want to give a huge shout out and thanks to my colleague Tim Franklin, who was the Senior Associate Dean and holds the Mutz Chair and is the Director of the Local News Initiative. He is doing just a heroic job on many fronts, working with media outlets, working with Teach for Chicago Journalism, helping us to go out and proselytize not just for journalism, but for, once again, the importance of having an informed public. We in Medill are taking a very, very deep dive in news literacy, and I want to also thank our partners at the News Literacy Project for helping us to convene this event. Thank you, Demario. We are taking a deep dive in local news because we think it is so important. Watching the diminution and what's happened to local news across the country is perilous. It is something that agitates many of us and animates many of us. And I believe that an institution like Medill has a greater responsibility than just training the next generation of journalists. We have a responsibility to roll our sleeves up and make sure that local news continues. And I'm very committed to that, and I'm very happy and grateful to have a really talented and hardworking team that's committed to that as well. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope that we can enlist you in our efforts to save local news as well, and I wish you well. Take care.